Babysitter vanished in 1978. 23 years passed, and the same child took revenge in an unimaginable way. The musty scent of old paper and forgotten memories filled Margaret's lungs as she climbed the narrow stairs to her grandmother's attic. It was a suffocating August afternoon in 2001, and the New England heat had turned the cramped space into an oven. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to discover: a yellowed newspaper clipping that would shatter everything she thought. She knew about her childhood and send her down a rabbit hole of secrets that had been buried for 23 years. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. Margaret Henderson was 28 years old, methodical by nature, and possessed the kind of sharp, analytical mind that came from years of working as a research librarian in Boston. She had returned to the small coastal town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, to settle her grandmother's estate, a duty that felt more like a pilgrimage to a past she'd tried hard to leave behind. The Victorian house on Elm Street had been home to 3 generations of women, each carrying their own burden of secrets. As she sorted through decades of accumulated belongings, Margaret's fingers traced over faded photographs, handwritten recipes, and boxes of correspondence. The attic smelled of lavender sachets and old wood, punctuated by the distant sound of seagulls crying over the harbor. Everything felt ordinary, predictable, until she opened a shoebox tucked behind a trunk of winter clothes. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, lay a newspaper clipping from the Millbrook Gazette, dated October 15, 1978. The headline made her stomach drop. "Local babysitter disappears without trace." But it wasn't the words that stopped her cold. It was the photograph accompanying the article. The missing woman looked exactly like her. Sarah Mitchell, aged 22, had vanished on a crisp October evening while babysitting for a local family. The photograph showed a young woman with Margaret's same dark hair, the identical shape of her eyes, even the small scar above her left eyebrow that Margaret had always assumed came from a childhood accident. The resemblance was so striking it felt like looking into a mirror that reflected the past. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the details. Sarah had been caring for the Henderson children, her own family, the night she disappeared. The last person to see her alive was 5-year-old Margaret herself, who had been put to bed early that evening with what everyone assumed was a simple cold. But here's what made Margaret's blood run cold. October 1978 wasn't just when Sarah vanished. It was the exact same month her own mother had left town forever, abandoning her 5-year-old daughter without explanation or goodbye. For 23 years, Margaret had believed her mother simply walked away from a life she didn't want. Now, staring at Sarah's face, her own face, she realized the truth might be far more sinister. What if her mother hadn't abandoned her at all? What if she had been running from something or someone much more dangerous? As thunder rumbled over Millbrook Harbor and rain began to tap against the attic windows, Margaret clutched the newspaper clipping to her chest. She had come home to bury the past, but instead she was about to resurrect it. And in doing so, she would uncover a web of corruption, lies, and murder that had been festering in her hometown for over 2 decades. The babysitter who vanished in 1978 was about to get justice, delivered by the very child she had protected on that final, fateful night. The rain hammered against the attic windows as Margaret stared at the newspaper clipping, her mind racing back to that October night in 1978. She had been just 5 years old. But some memories burn so deep, they never fade, especially the ones that change everything. That evening had started like any other. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the Henderson house just as the sun was setting over Millbrook Harbor, her usual warm smile lighting up the doorway. Margaret remembered the scent of Sarah's vanilla perfume and the way she always brought a small bag of peppermint candies hidden in her coat pocket. But there was something different about Sarah that night. Something Margaret's 5-year-old mind had registered but couldn't understand. Sarah kept glancing toward the windows, her usual easy laughter replaced by nervous energy. She checked the locks on the front door twice, something she'd never done before. When the phone rang around 8 o'clock, Sarah's face went pale, and she spoke in hushed, urgent whispers that young Margaret couldn't quite make out from her position on the stairs. But what haunted Margaret most was the last thing Sarah had said to her before tucking her into bed. "Promise me something, sweet girl. If anything ever happens, if anyone ever asks you about tonight, you tell them you went to sleep early and didn't see anything. Can you promise me that?" Margaret had promised, not understanding why Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled the covers up to her chin. Within hours, Sarah Mitchell would be gone forever, and by morning, Margaret's mother would be packing their belongings with frantic urgency, claiming they needed to visit a sick relative in Boston. A relative who, Margaret would later discover, never existed. Now, 23 years later, Margaret realized that Sarah hadn't just been babysitting that night. She had been protecting something, or someone. And Margaret's mother hadn't abandoned her family on a whim. She had fled in terror, leaving behind a 5-year-old daughter and a husband who would spend the rest of his life wondering why his wife never came home. The official police report, which Margaret found tucked beneath the newspaper clipping, painted a different picture entirely. According to Sheriff Robert Pemberton Sr., Sarah Mitchell had simply decided to leave town for personal reasons. No investigation was launched. No search parties were organized. The case was closed before it ever really began. But why would a respected member of the community like Sheriff Pemberton be so eager to dismiss the disappearance of a beloved young woman? And why did the report contain so many inconsistencies? Times that didn't match witness statements, evidence that mysteriously went missing, and testimonies that seemed deliberately vague. As Margaret read through the sparse police file, one detail kept nagging at her. Sarah's car had been found abandoned at the edge of town, keys still in the ignition, her purse left behind on the passenger seat. But according to the report, there were no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. The official conclusion was that Sarah had simply walked away from her life, leaving everything behind. But Margaret knew something the 1978 investigators had either missed or chosen to ignore. Sarah Mitchell wasn't the type of woman to abandon her responsibilities, and she certainly wasn't the type to disappear without saying goodbye to the little girl she'd cared for like her own daughter. The Millbrook police station still smelled the same after all these years. Stale coffee, floor wax, and that particular mustiness that comes from decades of small-town secrets being swept under bureaucratic rugs. Margaret pushed through the glass doors on a humid Tuesday morning, the newspaper clipping and police report clutched in her sweaty palm like evidence in a trial that never happened. Deputy Tom Sullivan looked up from his paperwork, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The boy she'd grown up with had become a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that still held traces of the mischief she remembered from their childhood adventures along the harbor. But there was something else there now, something that looked almost like guilt. "Margaret Henderson," Tom said, rising from his desk with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Heard you were back in town. Sorry about your grandmother." "Tom, I need to ask you about something," Margaret said, placing the yellowed clipping on his desk. "Do you remember Sarah Mitchell?" The change in Tom's expression was immediate and telling. His jaw tightened, and he glanced nervously toward the sheriff's office at the back of the station. "Sarah Mitchell? That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Why are you asking about her?" Margaret explained about finding the newspaper clipping, about the uncanny resemblance, about the night her mother disappeared. With each detail, Tom's frown deepened, and she could see him struggling with something, some internal conflict that made his hands fidget with the papers on his desk. "Margaret," he said finally, lowering his voice, "you need to understand something. That case? It was handled by my father. He was Sheriff Pemberton's right-hand man back then, and he always said there were things about that night that didn't add up." "What kind of things?" Tom glanced toward the sheriff's office again, then leaned closer. My dad kept his own notes, separate from the official file. He never trusted how quickly the case was closed. But when he tried to ask questions, Sheriff Pemberton told him to drop it, said it would be better for everyone if Sarah Mitchell stayed gone. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had never been properly extinguished. But before Margaret could respond, a door slammed at the back of the station and heavy footsteps approached. Sheriff Robert Pemberton, Jr. emerged from his office, his presence filling the room with an authority that felt more like intimidation. "Deputy Sullivan," the sheriff said, his eyes fixed on Margaret with undisguised suspicion. "Is there a problem here?" Robert Pemberton, Jr. was nothing like his father. Where the elder Pemberton had been politically smooth and charming, his son was blunt, aggressive, with the kind of cold stare that suggested he'd inherited more than just a badge from his family legacy. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as he approached, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "No problem, Sheriff," Tom said quickly. "Ms. Henderson was just asking about some old records." "What kind of records?" Pemberton's voice carried a warning that was impossible to miss. Margaret straightened her shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm researching my family history, Sheriff. I found some old newspaper clippings about a woman who used to babysit for us. Sarah Mitchell. She disappeared in 1978. Something flickered in Pemberton's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or maybe just annoyance. "Ancient history, Ms. Henderson. Some people leave town because they want to start over somewhere else. Nothing mysterious about that." But her car was found abandoned. Her purse left behind. "Case was closed decades ago," Pemberton cut her off. "No evidence of foul play. Matter of fact, I believe my father handled that investigation personally. He was very thorough." The way he emphasized "very thorough" made it clear that any further questions would not be welcome. But as Margaret left the police station, Tom followed her outside, glancing back to make sure they weren't being watched. "Meet me at the diner on Harbor Street tonight at 8, he whispered. "There's something you need to see. Something my father left me before he died. But Margaret, be careful. If Sheriff Pemberton doesn't want this case reopened, there might be a good reason for that. What could be so dangerous about a 23-year-old missing person case that even the current sheriff wanted it buried? And why did Tom Sullivan look so afraid when he talked about his own father's investigation?" The Harbor Street diner buzzed with the familiar sounds of small-town evening routines. The clink of coffee cups, the sizzle of burgers on the grill, and the low murmur of conversations about weather, fishing catches, and local gossip. Margaret chose a corner booth where shadows gathered thick enough to hide secrets. Her eyes trained on the door as she waited for Tom Sullivan. At exactly 8 o'clock, Tom slipped through the entrance, his police uniform traded for civilian clothes that somehow made him look more vulnerable. He scanned the diner with the practiced eye of a law enforcement officer before sliding into the seat across from Margaret, a manila folder clutched against his chest like armor. "Before I show you this," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to understand something. My father spent the last 15 years of his life carrying this burden. It ate at him, Margaret. The guilt, the questions he could never ask, the answers he was afraid to find." The waitress approached with coffee, but Tom waved her away with a nervous gesture. Only when they were alone again did he open the folder, revealing pages of handwritten notes, photographs, and what looked like interview transcripts, all bearing the unofficial stamp of the investigation that had been conducted in shadows. "My dad interviewed Sarah's neighbors, her friends, people who worked with her at the library," Tom explained, spreading the documents across the scratched formica table. What he found didn't match the official story at all. The first photograph made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. It showed Sarah Mitchell's abandoned car, but from an angle that revealed something the official crime scene photos had missed, or deliberately excluded. There, barely visible in the gravel beside the driver's door, was what appeared to be a struggle. Scuffed dirt, a torn piece of fabric caught on the car's door handle, and dark stains on the ground that could have been blood. Your father documented evidence that wasn't in the official file? Margaret asked, her researcher's mind already cataloging the implications. Tom nodded grimly. That's not all. Look at this. He handed her a witness statement, written in his father's careful handwriting. Mrs. Rodriguez lived 3 houses down from Sarah. She told my dad she heard Sarah's car start up around 11:30 that night, then heard it again around 12:15, like someone had driven it somewhere and brought it back. But the official timeline claimed Sarah had left the Henderson house at 10:30 and driven straight out of town. The math didn't work, and according to Tom's father's notes, no one had bothered to investigate the discrepancy. There's more, Tom continued, pulling out another document. Sarah had been asking questions around town in the weeks before she disappeared. Questions about the Pemberton family's textile mill, about worker safety violations, about pension funds that had mysteriously disappeared. Margaret's pulse quickened. The Pemberton family, the same family that had controlled the sheriff's department for 2 generations. The same family whose current patriarch had made it very clear that Sarah Mitchell's case should stay closed. Sarah was investigating the mill? Margaret asked. According to my dad's notes, she'd been meeting secretly with workers who were afraid to come forward officially. The mill had been cutting corners on safety equipment, doctoring inspection reports, and somehow pension funds kept disappearing. Workers who complained had a tendency to lose their jobs. Or worse. Tom pulled out a final document that made Margaret's hands tremble. It was a letter addressed to Sarah Mitchell, postmarked the day before she disappeared. The return address was from the Boston Herald newspaper, and though the envelope had been opened, the letter itself was missing. A newspaper was interested in Sarah's story, Margaret whispered, the pieces clicking into place. She was going to be a whistleblower. My father thought so too. But here's the part that kept him awake at night. Sarah never made it to that meeting with the newspaper, because she disappeared first, almost like someone knew exactly what she was planning to do. The implications were staggering. Sarah Mitchell hadn't simply vanished, she had been silenced, and if Tom's father was right, the people responsible had been walking free in Millbrook for 23 years, protected by badges and political influence. But as Margaret stared at the evidence spread across the diner table, one question burned brighter than all the others. If Sarah had been investigating the Pemberton family, and if Margaret's mother had fled town the same night Sarah disappeared, what connection did her own family have to this decades-old conspiracy? The truth was starting to emerge from the shadows, and Margaret was beginning to understand that her search for answers about Sarah Mitchell might ultimately reveal the most painful truth of all: why her mother had really left her behind. Elena Vasquez lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of Millbrook, where the salt air mixed with the scent of the wild roses that climbed her weathered fence. At 78, her hands were still steady enough to thread a needle, though the arthritis made her fingers curl like old tree branches. When Margaret knocked on her door that September morning, Elena's dark eyes studied her visitor with the intensity of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. "You look like her," Elena said without preamble, stepping aside to let Margaret enter. "Sarah Mitchell. Though I suppose that's why you're here." The cottage was small but immaculate, filled with the kind of handmade beauty that came from a lifetime of working with fabric and thread. Quilts covered every surface, their intricate patterns telling stories of patience and skill. But it was the wall of photographs that caught Margaret's attention. Dozens of pictures showing the Pemberton textile mill in its heyday, workers gathered around machinery, celebrations and protests, and faces that had long since been forgotten by most of the town. "I worked at the mill for 37 years, Elena said, settling into a rocking chair that creaked with familiar comfort. "Started when I was 16, fresh off the boat from El Salvador. The Pembertons gave me work when no one else would, and for a long time, I was grateful." She gestured toward a particular photograph showing a group of women hunched over sewing machines, their faces illuminated by the harsh industrial lighting. "That's me in 1975. 3 years before everything changed. I thought I was lucky to have steady work, decent pay, benefits that would take care of my husband and me in our old age. But something changed? Margaret asked gently. Elena's expression hardened. In 1978, workers started noticing problems. Safety equipment that should have been replaced wasn't. Overtime, pay that disappeared from checks. And then the pension fund. Money we'd been paying into for decades. Suddenly it wasn't there anymore when people tried to retire. She stood with difficulty and moved to an old wooden trunk, pulling out a shoebox similar to the one Margaret had found in her grandmother's attic. But Elena's box contained something far more dangerous than newspaper clippings. It held evidence. Sarah Mitchell came to me in September of 1978, Elena said, returning to her chair with the box cradled in her lap. She said she was doing research for a school project about local industry, but I could tell it was more than that. She asked questions that showed she already knew about the problems at the mill. Elena opened the box, revealing documents that made Margaret's pulse quicken. Payroll records showing discrepancies, safety inspection reports with suspicious amendments, and, most damaging of all, internal memos discussing the systematic theft of worker pension funds. How did Sarah get these documents? Margaret asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. She had help from the inside, Elena replied. Someone with access to the mill's financial records. Someone who trusted her enough to risk everything. Sarah was dating someone connected to the mill. Someone whose conscience was stronger than their fear. Who? Elena's eyes grew sad. James Henderson, your father. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her father, quiet, reliable James Henderson, who had worked as the mill's bookkeeper for 30 years, had been Sarah Mitchell's secret source. He had been feeding her information about the Pemberton family's illegal activities, helping her build a case that could have brought down the most powerful family in town. So, my father was... Margaret struggled to process the implications. He was helping Sarah investigate his own employers? Your father was a good man who couldn't stand by and watch people get cheated out of their life savings, Elena said firmly. But he was also a man with a family to protect. When Sarah disappeared, James knew he could be next. That's why your mother left town so suddenly. She was protecting you and herself. Elena pulled out a final document from the box, a letter written in Sarah's careful handwriting and addressed to James Henderson. It was dated October 13, 1978, just 2 days before Sarah's disappearance. The letter was brief but devastating. James, I have enough evidence now to bring this to the authorities. The reporter from Boston will be here tomorrow night. After we meet with her, the Pembertons won't be able to hurt anyone else. Thank you for having the courage to do what's right. But Sarah never made it to that meeting, and the reporter she was supposed to meet, the one who could have exposed the corruption and brought justice to the workers who had been cheated, had been left waiting for a source who would never arrive. As Margaret sat in Elena's cottage, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had destroyed lives and silenced voices, she finally understood the true scope of what had happened in 1978. Sarah Mitchell hadn't just been investigating a story. She had been building a case that could have sent the Pemberton family to prison, and someone had been willing to kill to stop her. Elena, Margaret said slowly, the reporter Sarah was supposed to meet with. Do you know who it was? The elderly woman's expression grew troubled. I never knew her name, but Sarah mentioned she was young, ambitious, working on a series about labor violations in small New England towns. Elena paused, studying Margaret's face. Sarah said this reporter had a personal connection to Millbrook, said her daughter lived here. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Margaret's mother hadn't been just any reporter. She had been the journalist Sarah was supposed to meet. She had come to Millbrook to expose the truth. But when Sarah disappeared, she realized that she and her daughter were next on the list. So she had made the most painful choice a mother can make. She had left her child behind to keep her safe. The Boston Herald archives smelled like old paper and forgotten deadlines, a scent that Margaret found oddly comforting as she scrolled through microfilm records from October 1978. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the machine's focus, searching for any trace of her mother's work that might explain why Catherine Henderson had vanished from her daughter's life with nothing but a hastily written note claiming a family emergency. After 3 hours of searching, Margaret finally found what she was looking for. Buried in the Herald's employment records was a listing for Catherine Winters, her mother's maiden name, hired in August 1978 as an investigative journalist specializing in labor disputes. The personnel file was thin, containing only basic information, but it confirmed what Elena Vasquez had suspected. Margaret's mother had been the reporter Sarah Mitchell was supposed to meet, but finding her mother's professional identity was only the beginning. Margaret's real breakthrough came when she discovered a storage unit rented under Catherine Winters's name. The monthly payments automatically deducted from a bank account that had remained active for 23 years. Someone had been maintaining this storage unit, keeping whatever secrets it contained safe and accessible. The storage facility on the outskirts of Boston was a maze of corrugated metal buildings that looked like they'd been forgotten by time. Unit 247 was tucked away in a corner, its metal door secured with a lock that looked newer than the building itself. When Margaret turned the key, found taped to the bottom of her grandmother's jewelry box, the door rolled open with a screech that seemed to echo through decades of silence. Inside, carefully preserved in plastic containers and filing cabinets, was the complete record of an investigation that had been cut short by fear and violence. Her mother had been working on a series called Milltown Secrets, documenting labor violations and financial corruption in small New England communities. Millbrook had been intended as the centerpiece of the series, with Sarah Mitchell as the primary source. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened file after file, each one revealing another layer of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. Her mother had been in contact with Sarah for months before that fateful October night, building a case that would have exposed not just the Pemberton family's crimes, but a network of corruption that extended throughout the region. But the most devastating discovery was a collection of audio recordings, interviews her mother had conducted with Sarah in the weeks leading up to the planned meeting. Margaret listened to Sarah's voice for the first time in 23 years, and the sound transported her back to bedtime stories and peppermint candies, to the warmth of being tucked in by someone who truly cared. The pension fund theft is just the beginning. Sarah's voice crackled through the old recording equipment. I think the Pembertons have been using their political connections to cover up safety violations that have led to deaths. Workers who got sick from chemical exposure, accidents that were covered up, families who were paid to stay quiet about what really happened to their loved ones. Catherine's voice responded with professional calm, but Margaret could hear the underlying tension. How dangerous is this story, Sarah? Are you concerned about your safety? There was a long pause before Sarah answered. I'm being careful. But Catherine, if something happens to me, you need to know that I've hidden evidence in multiple locations. I've documented everything, and I've made sure that even if I disappear, the truth will eventually come out. The recording continued with details about meeting locations, backup plans, and contingency measures that spoke to a level of fear that made Margaret's heart ache. Sarah Mitchell had known she was in danger, but she had been determined to see justice done, even if it cost her everything. But it was the final recording that broke Margaret's heart. Dated October 14, 1978, the day before Sarah disappeared, it captured a phone conversation between Sarah and Catherine that revealed the true scope of what they were up against. Cedit, Catherine, I think they know. Sarah's voice was tight with fear. Someone broke into my apartment last night. Nothing was taken, but my papers had been moved. They're sending a message. Then we need to move up our timeline, Catherine replied. Can you meet me tonight instead of tomorrow? I can't. I promised the Hendersons I'd watch Margaret tonight. Her parents are attending some mill function. Ironically, one of the events where the Pembertons are being honored for their community service. Sarah's bitter laugh carried across the decades. Oh, di tupo, chpupap apo tried. But Catherine, if something happens to me, you need to promise me something. That little girl, Margaret, she's special. Make sure she's protected. Her father is risking everything to help us. And if this goes wrong, she might be the only innocent person left in this whole mess. The recording ended there, but Margaret's mother had made one final entry in her notes. Sarah failed to appear at meeting. Apartment searched by unknown parties. Leaving Millbrook immediately. Will continue investigation from safe distance. But Catherine Winters had never published her story. Instead, she had disappeared as completely as Sarah Mitchell, leaving behind a 5-year-old daughter and a husband who would spend the rest of his life wondering what had gone wrong. As Margaret sat surrounded by 23 years of carefully preserved evidence, she finally understood the impossible choice her mother had made. Catherine had realized that exposing the truth would put her daughter in mortal danger, so she had chosen exile over justice, protection over revelation. But now, 2 decades later, Margaret held in her hands everything needed to finish what her mother and Sarah Mitchell had started. The question was whether she had the courage to risk everything, including her life, to finally deliver the justice that had been denied for so long. The truth was within her grasp, but would pursuing it cost Margaret the same price Sarah and her mother had paid? The Millbrook Public Library had been Margaret's sanctuary as a child, a place where she could lose herself in stories that took her far from the whispered conversations and worried glances that followed her mother's disappearance. Now, returning as an adult with a box full of evidence and a head full of dangerous questions, she saw the stately brick building through different eyes. Mrs. Henley, the head librarian who had known Margaret since she was old enough to reach the picture book shelves, greeted her with the same warm smile she'd worn for 40 years. But when Margaret mentioned Sarah Mitchell's name, something shifted in the elderly woman's expression. A subtle tightening around her eyes that spoke of long-held secrets. Sarah was one of our best volunteers, Mrs. Henley said carefully, leading Margaret through the familiar stacks toward the local history section. She had a gift for research, could find information that others missed. She spent a lot of time here in the months before she left town. What kind of research was she doing? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Mrs. Henley glanced around nervously, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Historical records, mostly. Old town council minutes, property deeds, business licenses. She was particularly interested in the mill's safety. Records and worker compensation claims from the 1970s. They reached a section of the library that Margaret barely remembered from her childhood, a cramped area filled with file cabinets, bound volumes of local newspapers, and boxes of documents that constituted Millbrook's unofficial archive. It was here, Mrs. Henley explained, that Sarah had spent countless hours in the summer and fall of 1978. "There's something else," Mrs. Henley said, her voice dropping to a whisper. After Sarah disappeared, people came looking for her research. Official people, or at least they claimed to be. They wanted to know what she'd been working on, which documents she'd accessed. "Did you tell them?" Mrs. Henley's smile was sly despite her age. "I told them what they wanted to hear. But Sarah was smarter than they gave her credit for. She knew she was being watched, so she found ways to hide her real research." The elderly librarian led Margaret to a section of children's books that seemed completely ordinary. Classic fairy tales, adventure stories, and picture books that had been entertaining young readers for decades. But Mrs. Henley selected a particular volume, Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales, and opened it to reveal that the pages had been carefully hollowed out to create a hidden compartment. Inside were photocopied documents that made Margaret's breath catch. Safety inspection reports from the Pemberton mill showing repeated violations that had been ignored or covered up. Medical records of workers who had suffered mysterious illnesses after exposure to chemicals that the mill claimed were harmless. And most damning of all, internal correspondence between the mill's management and local officials discussing how to manage workers who were becoming too vocal about safety concerns. Sarah called this her insurance policy, Mrs. Henley explained. She said if anything happened to her, eventually someone would come looking in the right places. She was counting on people like you, Margaret, people who cared enough to ask the right questions. But the children's books held more than just documents. Hidden within Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was a small journal written in Sarah's careful handwriting, documenting meetings with sources, recording conversations, and noting suspicious activities around town. The final entry was dated October 13, 1978, 2 days before Sarah's disappearance. "They know I'm getting close," Sarah had written. "James is scared, and he has every right to be. The Pembertons aren't just stealing money. They're covering up deaths, workers who died from chemical exposure, accidents that were made to look like personal negligence. The families were paid to stay quiet, but some of them kept records. If I can get those records to Catherine's newspaper contact, we can prove everything." The journal continued with detailed plans for the meeting that would never take place, backup locations in case the primary meeting spot was compromised, and, most chillingly, instructions for what should happen if Sarah didn't survive to see justice done. "I've made copies of everything and hidden them in places only someone who truly knew me would think to look," the journal concluded. "If I disappear, the truth is still out there waiting to be found. Someone will piece it together eventually. Someone who understands that justice delayed is not justice denied. It's just justice waiting for the right person to claim it." As Margaret read those words, written by a woman who knew she was walking toward her own destruction, she felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. Sarah Mitchell had been preparing for this moment. Not her disappearance, but the moment when someone would finally have the courage and resources to finish what she had started. "Mrs. Henley," Margaret said softly, "did Sarah ever mention being afraid of someone specific? Did she say who she thought was threatening her?" The elderly librarian's face grew grave. "She never said names, but she did mention something that stuck with me. She said the most dangerous criminals are the ones who hide behind badges and political positions, because people trust them automatically. She said in a town like Millbrook, corruption doesn't wear a mask, it wears a uniform." The implication was clear, but it also raised a terrifying question. If the local law enforcement had been compromised in 1978, how could Margaret trust anyone in authority now? Sheriff Pemberton Jr. had already made his hostility clear, and even Tom Sullivan, despite his apparent willingness to help, was still part of a system that had covered up Sarah's disappearance for over 2 decades. But, as Margaret carefully returned Sarah's evidence to its hiding places among the children's books, she realized that she now possessed something that neither Sarah nor her mother had in 1978: time, distance, and the ability to expose the truth without relying on local authorities. The question was whether she could stay alive long enough to use it. What Margaret didn't know was that her visits to the library hadn't gone unnoticed, and that someone had been watching her every move since she'd started asking questions about Sarah Mitchell. The same forces that had silenced Sarah and driven her mother into exile were still active in Millbrook, and they were about to make their presence known. Harbor Grounds Coffee Shop occupied a narrow building on Millbrook's main street, squeezed between a hardware store and an antique shop like an afterthought. The exposed brick walls were decorated with local artwork and community announcements, creating the kind of cozy atmosphere that invited lingering conversations and quiet observations. For the past 6 months, Lisa Chen had been working behind the counter, serving lattes and listening to the town's secrets with the patience of someone who understood the value of information. Margaret had been coming to Harbor Grounds every morning since returning to Millbrook, drawn by their excellent coffee and the quiet corner table where she could spread out her research without attracting attention. She had noticed Lisa immediately, a young woman in her early 20s with intelligent dark eyes and an almost uncanny ability to remember every customer's order. What Margaret hadn't noticed was how carefully Lisa had been studying her in return. It was a rainy Thursday morning in October when Lisa finally made her move. Margaret was sitting at her usual table, surrounded by photocopied documents and newspaper clippings, when the young woman approached with a coffee cup and a nervous smile. "Excuse me," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I couldn't help noticing that you've been researching Sarah Mitchell." Margaret looked up sharply, her hand instinctively moving to cover the documents on the table. In the weeks since she'd started her investigation, she'd learned to be careful about who she trusted with information. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Margaret asked cautiously. Lisa glanced around the nearly empty coffee shop, then pulled out the chair across from Margaret and sat down without invitation. "My name is Lisa Chen, and I think we need to talk, because you're not the only person in Millbrook who's been trying to find out what really happened to Sarah Mitchell." There was something in Lisa's tone that made Margaret pay attention, a weight of knowledge that seemed too heavy for someone so young to carry. When Lisa reached into her apron and pulled out a photograph, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The photo showed Sarah Mitchell, but not the formal portrait that had appeared in the newspaper clipping. This was a candid shot of Sarah laughing at something off-camera, her face radiant with joy. But what made Margaret's hands shake was the unmistakable resemblance between Sarah and the young woman sitting across from her. "You're her daughter," Margaret whispered, the words barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. Lisa nodded, her eyes filling with tears she'd been holding back for months. "Sarah Mitchell was my mother, and I've been looking for answers about what happened to her my entire life." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. All those mornings when Lisa had served her coffee with a knowing smile, all those carefully casual conversations about Margaret's research project, none of it had been coincidence. Lisa had been watching Margaret just as carefully as Margaret had been investigating Sarah's disappearance. "How long have you known who I was?" Margaret asked. "Since the day you walked into this coffee shop," Lisa admitted. "I've been in Millbrook for 6 months, working here, listening, trying to piece together what happened the night my mother disappeared. When you started asking questions about Sarah Mitchell, I knew you had to be connected somehow." Lisa pulled out a small notebook from her apron, its pages filled with the kind of detailed observations that would have made any investigator proud. She had been documenting conversations she'd overheard, noting who seemed nervous when Sarah's name was mentioned, tracking the patterns of behavior that might reveal who had something to hide. "The Pemberton family still controls this town," Lisa said, keeping her voice low. "But they're not as careful as they used to be. Sheriff Pemberton Jr. comes in here twice a week, and he talks on his phone like nobody's listening. I've heard him discussing the Mitchell problem more than once since you've been asking questions." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "What kind of discussions?" "He's been getting pressure from someone, I think his father, about keeping the case closed." "But there's something else, Margaret. Someone's been asking questions about you too, about your family, about why you're really here." The young woman reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope that looked remarkably similar to the one Tom Sullivan had shown Margaret at the diner. But Lisa's evidence was different, more personal, more painful. "After my mother disappeared, I was raised by foster families," Lisa explained. "But when I turned 18, I got access to her personal effects that had been stored by the state. Most of it was ordinary, clothes, books, personal items, but hidden in the lining of her suitcase, I found these." Lisa opened the envelope to reveal a collection of photographs that made Margaret's world tilt on its axis. The images showed Sarah Mitchell in the weeks before her disappearance, but she wasn't alone. In several of the photos, she was clearly pregnant, her condition carefully hidden beneath loose clothing, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. "My mother was pregnant when she disappeared," Lisa said quietly. "I was born 3 months later, in a women's shelter in Portland, Maine. She gave birth to me, and then she was gone." The shelter workers said she was sick, that she'd been in hiding from someone who wanted to hurt her. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Sarah Mitchell hadn't just been investigating the Pemberton family's crimes, she had been pregnant with evidence that could connect someone powerful to her personally. The motivation for silencing her hadn't just been about money or corruption. It had been about preventing a scandal that could have destroyed careers and reputations. "Lisa," Margaret said carefully, "do you know who your father is?" The young woman's expression grew hard. "I have my suspicions, but I've been waiting for the right moment to prove it. And I think that moment might be now, especially with your help." She pulled out the final item from her envelope, a DNA test kit that looked recently purchased. "There's someone in this town who's been very nervous about my presence here. Someone who's been asking too many questions about what I know and who I've talked to. Someone who might be very interested to learn that Sarah Mitchell's daughter is alive and looking for answers." As Margaret stared at the DNA kit, she realized that Lisa's investigation had been far more sophisticated than her own. While Margaret had been focused on uncovering the truth about what happened to Sarah, Lisa had been building a case that could not only expose the corruption that led to her mother's disappearance, but also identify the person whose secrets had been worth killing for. "Who do you suspect?" Margaret asked, though part of her already feared the answer. Lisa's smile was grim but determined. "Someone with enough power to cover up a murder for 23 years. Someone who's been watching both of us very carefully since we started working together. Someone who's about to discover that the daughter he never knew existed is finally ready to claim her inheritance." But what was that inheritance? Justice for her mother's disappearance? Or something far more dangerous? The kind of truth that people had already killed to keep hidden? The abandoned lighthouse on Millbrook's rocky coastline had been watching over the harbor for over a century. Its beacon long since extinguished, but its stone tower still standing as a monument to safer passages and forgotten storms. It was here, in the shadow of crumbling walls and salt-stained windows, that Margaret and Lisa met on a fog-shrouded evening to plan their next move. A meeting that would either bring them justice or put them both in mortal danger. Lisa arrived first, her car hidden behind a cluster of scrub pines that had grown wild in the years since the lighthouse had been abandoned. When Margaret's headlights cut through the October darkness, Lisa emerged from the shadows like a ghost from the past, carrying a bag that contained evidence 23 years in the making. "We can't trust anyone in official positions," Lisa said without preamble as they climbed the lighthouse's winding stairs to a room where they could speak without fear of being overheard. "I've been watching, listening, documenting everything since I arrived in Millbrook. The corruption goes deeper than just the Pemberton family." The upper room of the lighthouse smelled of sea air and decay, but it offered something more valuable than comfort: privacy and a clear view of anyone approaching from the town below. Lisa spread her evidence across a makeshift table fashioned from old wooden crates, creating a timeline that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning decades. "Your father wasn't the only mill employee feeding information to my mother," Lisa explained, pointing to documents she'd carefully organized. "There was a whole network of people who knew what was happening but were too afraid to come forward officially. Some of them are still alive, still living in Millbrook, still keeping quiet, because they're terrified." Margaret studied the timeline Lisa had created, noting dates, connections, and patterns that revealed the true scope of what Sarah Mitchell had been investigating. The pension fund theft was just one piece of a larger puzzle that included environmental violations, worker safety cover-ups, and political corruption that extended beyond the mill to include city council members, state officials, and even federal inspectors who had been bought and paid for. "But here's what my mother discovered that got her killed," Lisa continued, pulling out a document that made Margaret's blood run cold. It was a birth certificate, Sarah Mitchell's birth certificate, revealing information that neither Margaret nor Lisa had suspected. Sarah Mitchell hadn't been just another mill worker's daughter. She had been Robert Pemberton Sr.'s niece, the illegitimate child of his brother who had died in a mill accident that was later covered up as natural causes. Sarah had been investigating her own family's crimes, gathering evidence that could have destroyed the Pemberton legacy and exposed decades of systematic murder disguised as workplace accidents. That's why they couldn't just fire her or intimidate her like the other workers, Lisa said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She was family, which meant she had access to information that outsiders could never get. But it also meant that when she became a threat, the betrayal went deeper than business. It was personal. Margaret processed this revelation with growing horror. So when Sarah threatened to expose the family's crimes, she wasn't just threatening their business empire, Lisa finished. She was threatening to reveal that the Pembertons had been systematically murdering workers for decades and covering it up with bribes, false reports, and political influence. The pension fund theft was small compared to the blood money they'd been stealing. But Lisa had saved the most devastating revelation for last. From her bag, she pulled out a leather journal that looked far older than Sarah's investigation notes. A journal that had belonged to Robert Pemberton Sr. himself, detailing not just the cover-ups, but the planning and execution of what amounted to industrial genocide. I found this hidden in the wall of my mother's apartment when I finally got access to it last year, Lisa explained. She must have stolen it during one of her visits to the Pemberton house. It contains detailed records of every worker who was deliberately exposed to toxic chemicals, every safety device that was sabotaged, every family that was paid to stay quiet about suspicious deaths. The journal's pages read like a horror novel written in careful businessman's handwriting. Robert Pemberton Sr. had documented his crimes with the methodical precision of someone who believed he would never be caught, never be held accountable. The entries spanned from the 1950s to 1978, chronicling decades of deliberate murder in pursuit of profit margins. This is enough to reopen every suspicious death at the mill for the past 30 years, Margaret whispered, turning page after page of documented evil. This could send the entire Pemberton family to prison for life. Which is exactly why my mother had to disappear, Lisa said grimly. And why we're both in danger now. Because I'm betting the current generation of Pembertons knows this journal exists, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it back. As if summoned by her words, the sound of car engines cut through the night air. Margaret and Lisa rushed to the lighthouse windows to see a convoy of vehicles approaching along the coastal road. Police cars with their lights dark, moving with the stealth of predators closing in on their prey. They found us, Lisa said, already gathering her evidence into the bag. Someone must have been watching us, following us. But as the vehicles drew closer, Margaret realized something that made her stomach drop. The lead car wasn't a police cruiser, it was Sheriff Pemberton Jr.'s personal vehicle, followed by what looked like private security rather than official law enforcement. They're not here to arrest us, Margaret said. With growing horror, they're here to make us disappear, just like they did to your mother. The lighthouse suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. They were surrounded by water on 3 sides, with only one road leading back to town, a road that was now blocked by people who had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. But Sarah Mitchell had raised a daughter who inherited more than just her investigative instincts. Lisa had also inherited her mother's courage and her determination to see justice done, no matter the cost. Margaret, Lisa said, her voice steady despite the approaching danger. I need you to promise me something. If we don't both make it out of here tonight, I need you to make sure this evidence gets to the right people. Not the local authorities, not the state police, but federal investigators who can't be bought by the Pembertons. As the sound of footsteps began echoing through the lighthouse's lower levels, Margaret realized that their investigation had reached its most dangerous point. They had the evidence to expose decades of murder and corruption, but they were trapped by the very people they were trying to bring to justice. The question was whether Sarah Mitchell's daughter had inherited enough of her mother's cunning to escape the same fate that had silenced her 23 years earlier. The footsteps on the lighthouse stairs grew closer, but just as Margaret and Lisa prepared for the confrontation that could end their lives, a new sound cut through the night, the sharp crack of gunfire from somewhere outside the lighthouse. The approaching footsteps stopped abruptly, followed by confused shouting and the sound of people running. "What's happening?" Lisa whispered, pressing herself against the lighthouse wall as more gunshots echoed across the rocky coastline. Margaret moved carefully to the window, peering down at a scene that seemed like something from a nightmare. The vehicles that had surrounded the lighthouse were now under attack from the darkness beyond, muzzle flashes lighting up the night as an unseen force engaged Sheriff Pemberton Jr.'s men in a firefight that shattered the peaceful coastal evening. But it was the voice that called out from the darkness that made Margaret's knees go weak with shock and recognition. A voice she hadn't heard in 23 years, but would have known anywhere. "Margaret, Lisa, stay where you are until I give the all-clear." Catherine Henderson, Margaret's mother, was alive, armed, and apparently very good at what she did. The firefight lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours as Margaret and Lisa huddled in the lighthouse's upper room, listening to the sounds of a battle they couldn't fully see or understand. When silence finally returned to the coastline, broken only by the crash of waves against the rocks below, Catherine Henderson climbed the lighthouse stairs with the practiced stealth of someone who had spent decades living in the shadows. Margaret's first sight of her mother in 23 years was jarring. Catherine was older, obviously, but she moved with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to survive in dangerous places. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore dark clothing that suggested this wasn't her first nighttime operation. But her eyes were exactly as Margaret remembered them, filled with love and pain and the kind of guilt that never fully heals. "Hello, sweetheart," Catherine said softly, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "I know this isn't how you imagined we'd be reunited." For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. 23 years of abandonment, anger, and questions seemed to crystallize into a single overwhelming emotion that was part rage, part relief, and part desperate love for the mother who had left her behind. "You're alive," Margaret finally whispered. "All these years, you've been alive." "I've been in witness protection," Catherine explained, her eyes moving between Margaret and Lisa with obvious recognition. "After Sarah disappeared, I realized that exposing the truth would put you in danger, so I made a deal with federal investigators. I would help them build a case against the Pembertons and their network, but only if you were kept safe and unaware of what was really happening." Lisa stepped forward, studying Catherine with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost. "You knew my mother. You were supposed to meet with her the night she disappeared." Catherine's expression grew pained. "Sarah Mitchell was the bravest person I've ever known. She was willing to risk everything to expose the truth, even when she knew it would probably cost her life. When she didn't show up for our meeting, I knew something terrible had happened." "But you never published the story," Margaret said, her voice carrying decades of confusion and hurt. "You never exposed the Pembertons. You just disappeared." "Because I learned something that night that changed everything," Catherine replied. "Sarah wasn't just investigating the Mills crimes. She was pregnant. And she'd discovered information that would have destroyed not just the Pemberton family, but a network of corruption that extended to federal officials. Publishing the story would have signed death warrants for everyone involved, including you." Catherine moved to the lighthouse window, checking the coastline below before continuing her explanation. "I spent the next 20 years working with federal investigators, slowly building cases against corrupt officials, documenting evidence, and waiting for the right moment to bring down the entire network. But I also spent those years watching over you from a distance, making sure you were safe, making sure you had everything you needed." "You were watching me?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. The anonymous payments that helped with your college education, the scholarship that appeared when you needed it most, the research position that opened up exactly when you were looking for work. None of that was coincidence, Margaret. I couldn't be your mother, but I never stopped protecting you. Lisa had been listening to this reunion with growing impatience, her focus still on the immediate danger they faced. "This is all very touching," she said sharply. "But what about the men who just tried to kill us? What about Sheriff Pemberton and his people?" Catherine's smile was cold and professional. "Sheriff Pemberton Jr. and his associates have been arrested by federal agents who have been building this case for over 2 decades. The network that killed Sarah and forced me into hiding is finally being dismantled." She pulled out a satellite phone and made a quick call, speaking in codes that suggested this operation had been planned for months, possibly years. When she finished, she turned back to Margaret and Lisa with an expression that mixed triumph with regret. "The evidence you've both gathered over the past few months was the final piece we needed," Catherine explained. Lisa's discovery of her grandfather's journal, combined with Margaret's investigation into Sarah's disappearance, provided the proof we needed to move against the entire conspiracy. "Grandfather's journal?" Margaret asked, confused. Lisa nodded grimly. "Robert Pemberton Sr. was my grandfather. My mother, Sarah, was his niece, and when she threatened to expose the family's crimes, her own uncle ordered her death. But she survived, went into hiding, and had me before she was killed trying to return to gather more evidence." The revelation that Lisa was a Pemberton by blood, even illegitimate blood, added another layer of complexity to a story that seemed to grow more tangled with each revelation. But it also explained why the current generation of Pembertons had been so determined to prevent any investigation into Sarah's disappearance. They weren't just covering up crimes, they were covering up family murder. "So what happens now?" Margaret asked, looking between her mother and the young woman who had become her unlikely ally in seeking justice. Catherine's expression softened as she looked at her daughter. "Now we finish what Sarah started. The evidence you've gathered will put Robert Pemberton Jr. and his associates in prison for life. The families of the workers who were murdered will finally get justice. And maybe, if you can forgive me, we can try to rebuild what I destroyed when I left you behind." But as sirens began wailing in the distance and federal agents swarmed the lighthouse area, Margaret realized that getting justice for Sarah Mitchell was only the beginning. The real challenge would be learning to live with the truth about her family, her past, and the price that had been paid to keep her safe for 23 years. The babysitter who vanished in 1978 was finally going to get her justice. But for the people who loved her, the victory would always be shadowed by the knowledge of what that justice had cost. The federal courthouse in Boston buzzed with activity as the biggest corruption trial in New England history prepared to begin. Margaret sat in the gallery, watching as defendants in expensive suits were led to their tables. Robert Pemberton Jr., 3 mill supervisors, 2 state inspectors, and a city councilman who had spent decades covering up industrial murders for money. But it was the empty chair at the prosecution table that drew her attention, a chair reserved for a witness who would finally tell her story after 23 years of silence. Sarah Mitchell was alive. The revelation had come just days before the trial, delivered by Catherine Henderson with the careful precision of someone who had been keeping life-altering secrets for decades. Sarah hadn't died in 1978. She had been spirited away by federal agents who recognized that her knowledge was too valuable to lose, and her life, too, precious to sacrifice. For over 2 decades, she had been living under a new identity, helping to build cases against corrupt officials while watching her daughter grow up from a distance that must have felt like torture. "She wanted to contact you," Catherine had explained to Lisa during one of their preparatory meetings. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone in your life, she wanted to reach out. But doing so would have compromised not just her safety, but yours as well. The network we were fighting had resources and connections that extended far beyond Millbrook. Now, as the bailiff called the court to order, Margaret watched the doors at the back of the courtroom open to admit a woman in her 60s whose face bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had lived with fear and separation for far too long. Sarah Mitchell, now Sarah Williams according to her federal protection documents, walked toward the witness stand with the same determined stride that Margaret remembered from childhood. Lisa gripped Margaret's hand as her mother was sworn in, tears streaming down her face as she saw the woman who had given birth to her for the first time since she was 3 months old. 23 years of wondering, of searching, of building cases and gathering evidence had led to this moment. Mother and daughter finally in the same room, separated only by the width of a courtroom and the weight of decades of enforced silence. Sarah's testimony was devastating. For 3 hours, she methodically destroyed any hope the defendants might have had for acquittal, detailing not just the crimes she had witnessed, but the systematic nature of the conspiracy that had protected those crimes. Her voice was steady, professional, but Margaret could see the cost of speaking these truths in the way Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she referenced documents and photographs. The pension fund theft was designed to look like mismanagement, Sarah testified, but it was actually systematic embezzlement intended to fund bribes for safety inspectors and local officials. Workers weren't just being cheated out of their retirement money. They were being murdered by people who used that stolen money to buy silence from the authorities, who should have protected them. The defense. Attorneys tried desperately to discredit Sarah's testimony, pointing to her years in hiding, her assumed identity, her connection to federal law enforcement. But they couldn't explain away the physical evidence. Robert Pemberton Sr.'s journal, the hidden documents from the Mills files, the medical records that proved workers had been deliberately exposed to toxins. When Robert Pemberton Jr. took the stand in his own defense, his testimony only made things worse. The man who had inherited not just his father's business, but his father's criminal legacy, tried to claim ignorance of the systematic murders. But Sarah's evidence proved that he had not only known about the crimes, but had actively participated in covering them up. The journal entries show that you were present at meetings where worker deaths were planned, the prosecutor stated, holding up pages from the leather-bound book that had been Robert Pemberton Sr.'s confession to decades of murder. You signed off on safety reports that you knew contained false information. You authorized payments to families in exchange for their silence about suspicious deaths. Pemberton Jr.'s face had gone pale, but his response revealed the arrogance that had protected his family for generations. Those workers knew the risks when they took the jobs. If they chose to work in dangerous conditions, that was their decision. The statement sent a ripple of outrage through the courtroom gallery, where family members of murdered workers had been waiting decades for acknowledgement of their losses. But it also provided the prosecution with exactly what they needed: a defendant who showed no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of his crimes, and no recognition that the workers he had killed were human beings with families who loved them. When the verdicts were read 3 days later, the courtroom erupted in applause that had been building for over 4 decades. Guilty on all counts, multiple life sentences, financial penalties that would strip the Pemberton family of every asset they had accumulated through murder and corruption. But for Margaret, the real resolution came after the trial, in a small conference room where 3 generations of women sat together for the first time. Sarah Mitchell, Catherine Henderson, Lisa Chen, 3 lives that had been shaped by courage, sacrifice, and the determination to see justice done regardless of the personal cost. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her eyes moving between her daughter and the woman who had helped protect them both. "I'm sorry for all the years we lost, all the birthdays and holidays and quiet moments that were stolen from us. I'm sorry that seeking justice cost us so much." Lisa reached across the table to take her mother's hand, the first time they had touched since Lisa was an infant. "You didn't cost us anything, Mom. The people who committed those crimes, who forced you into hiding, who threatened our family, They're the ones who stole those years. But we got them back when it mattered most. Catherine watched this reunion with tears in her eyes, understanding better than anyone the price of the choices they had all made. The children we were trying to protect grew up to be the women who brought justice, she said softly. Maybe that was always meant to be the ending to this story. But was this really the ending? Or was it just the beginning of a new chapter for a family that had been scattered by violence and brought back together by truth? 6 months after the verdicts were handed down, Millbrook looked like a town in transition. The Pemberton textile mill had been seized by federal authorities and converted into a memorial and resource center for families affected by industrial crimes. The building that had once housed decades of systematic murder now served as a place of healing, education, and remembrance. Margaret walked through the memorial's main hall on a crisp spring morning, reading the names of workers whose deaths had finally been acknowledged as homicides rather than accidents. The wall stretched longer than she had expected. Over 200 names spanning 40 years of deliberate killing disguised as workplace mishaps. They estimate there were others, said Tom Sullivan, joining Margaret in front of the memorial wall. The former deputy had been promoted to sheriff after Pemberton Jr.'s conviction, tasked with rebuilding a police department whose credibility had been shattered by decades of corruption. Workers whose deaths were never reported, families who were too afraid to come forward, records that were destroyed before we could examine them. Tom had been instrumental in the investigation's success, providing crucial testimony about his father's unofficial notes and helping federal agents locate witnesses who had been too frightened to speak for decades. The guilt he carried about his family's connection to the cover-up had motivated him to ensure that justice was not only served, but seen to be served. Elena Vasquez wants to speak at the memorial dedication next week, Tom continued. She's 90 now, but she insists on representing the families who never got to see justice for their loved ones. Elena had become something of a local hero in the months following the trial, her courage in preserving evidence and speaking truth finally recognized by a community that had failed to protect her and her fellow workers. The small cottage where she had hidden Sarah's evidence was now a historical landmark, preserved as a testament to the power of ordinary people to resist extraordinary evil. But the ripple effects of the case extended far beyond Millbrook. Federal investigations had been launched in dozens of small New England towns, where similar patterns of industrial crime and official cover-ups had been documented. The Pemberton case had exposed a network of corruption that stretched across state lines and federal agencies, leading to reforms in worker safety laws, environmental regulations, and oversight of local law enforcement. "Have you heard from Lisa lately?" Tom asked, as they moved through the memorial's exhibits, documenting the investigation and trial. Margaret smiled, thinking of the young woman who had become both a sister and a partner in seeking justice. She's starting law school in the fall. Says she wants to specialize in worker rights and environmental crimes. Apparently, there's a lot of work to be done. Lisa had used her inheritance from the Pemberton estate, money that had been seized and redistributed to victims aus Gilead families, to establish a scholarship fund for students from working-class families who wanted to pursue careers in law enforcement, journalism, or environmental protection. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Robert Pemberton Sr.'s blood money was now funding the education of people dedicated to preventing the kinds of crimes he had committed. Margaret's own life had been transformed by the investigation in ways she was still discovering. Her work as a research librarian had evolved into something closer to investigative journalism, with several news organizations seeking her expertise in uncovering historical cover-ups and long-buried crimes. She had found her calling in giving voice to the voiceless, just as Sarah Mitchell had tried to do in 1978. But it was the personal relationships that had been rebuilt through this process that meant the most to her. Catherine Henderson had moved back to Millbrook, buying a small house near the harbor where she could finally be close to the daughter she had protected from a distance for so many years. The process of rebuilding their relationship was complicated and sometimes painful, but it was also healing in ways that neither of them had expected. "Your mother asked me to give you this," Tom said, handing Margaret an envelope that bore the familiar handwriting she was still learning to associate with love rather than abandonment. Inside was a photograph Margaret had never seen. A picture of herself at age 5, asleep in her childhood bedroom, with Sarah Mitchell reading quietly in a chair beside the bed. On the back, in Sarah's careful script, were the words, "Margaret Henderson, protected and loved, October 13th, 1978. "She took this the night before she disappeared," Catherine's note explained. "She wanted you to know that even in her darkest hour, when she was preparing for what might be her last night alive, her thoughts were of keeping you safe. She made me promise to give this to you when you were old enough to understand the choice she made." Margaret stared at the photograph, seeing in Sarah's face the same expression of protective love that she remembered from her childhood. But now she understood the weight of fear that Sarah had been carrying, the knowledge that sitting vigil over a sleeping child might be the last normal thing she would ever do. As Margaret stood in the memorial surrounded by the names of people who had died seeking justice, she realized that their investigation had accomplished something beyond punishment for the guilty. It had restored dignity to the victims, voice to the silenced, and hope to families who had spent decades believing that powerful people could commit crimes with impunity. The babysitter who vanished in 1978 had finally come home, and in doing so, she had brought home truths that would protect workers and families for generations to come. But one question remained. In a world where corruption and power often go hand in hand, how many other Sarah Mitchells were out there, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right questions and persistent enough to demand answers? The memorial wall in Millbrook stood as both a testament to past injustices and a challenge to future investigators. Never stop asking questions. Never stop seeking truth, and never accept that some people are above the law. 1 year after the conviction, Margaret found herself standing in the same attic where her journey had begun. But this time, she wasn't alone. Sarah Mitchell, no longer hiding behind an assumed name, knelt beside the trunk where the yellowed newspaper clipping had been discovered, carefully placing new items into a memory box that would tell the complete story for future generations. "I always hoped someone would find that clipping," Sarah said, her hands gentle as she arranged photographs, court documents, and letters that chronicled not just the crime and its consequences, but the healing that had followed. "I left it there hoping that someday, when it was safe, the right person would ask the right questions." The attic felt different now, lighter somehow, as if decades of secrets had been released into the open air, where they could no longer poison the shadows. Sunlight streamed through windows that Margaret had cleaned herself, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories finally set free. Lisa climbed the narrow stairs carrying a tray of tea, her law school textbooks visible in the bag slung over her shoulder. The young woman who had spent months serving coffee while secretly investigating her mother's disappearance was now openly studying to become the kind of lawyer who could prevent future cover-ups and ensure that justice reached even the most powerful criminals. "Mom, tell Margaret about the letter from Mrs. Chen," Lisa said, settling cross-legged on the attic floor, with the easy familiarity of someone who had been welcomed into a family that had been fractured for too long. Sarah smiled, pulling out an envelope from Hong Kong. Mrs. Chen was one of the mill workers whose husband died from chemical exposure in 1974. She moved back to China after his death, but she followed the trial through online news reports. She wrote to thank us for finally giving her husband's death the recognition it deserved. The letter was one of hundreds that had arrived in the months following the conviction. Families across New England and beyond had reached out to share their own stories of suspicious workplace deaths, environmental cover-ups, and official indifference to worker safety. The Pemberton case had become a catalyst for investigations and reforms that stretched far beyond Millbrook's borders. Catherine Henderson appeared in the attic doorway, her arms full of flowers from the garden she had been restoring behind her new house. The woman who had spent 23 years in hiding was now embracing the ordinary pleasures of small-town life: gardening, cooking, and most importantly, being present for the daughter she had protected from a distance for so long. "Elena called?" Catherine said, arranging the flowers in a mason jar that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother. "She wants to know if we'll all come to dinner next Sunday. She's cooking for the whole investigative team. Tom, the federal agents who worked the case, even some of the mill workers' families who testified." The idea of Elena Vasquez, now 90 years old, cooking for a dozen people would have seemed impossible a year ago, when she was still guarding secrets and fearing retribution. But the trial's outcome had freed not just the guilty from their crimes, but the innocent from their fear. Millbrook was slowly learning to be a community again, rather than a collection of people afraid to speak truth to power. Margaret watched as 3 generations of women who had been separated by violence and brought together by justice worked to preserve their story. The memory box Sarah was creating would join the official archives, but it would also serve a more personal purpose, ensuring that future generations understood not just what had happened, but what it had cost and why it had been worth the price. "I've been thinking about something," Margaret said, settling beside Sarah on the attic floor. "About forgiveness. Not for the people who committed crimes. They don't deserve that. But for ourselves, for the years we lost, for the choices we had to make." Sarah paused in her careful arrangement of documents, her eyes meeting Margaret's with understanding that came from shared experience. "I spent so many years angry at myself for not being stronger, for not finding a way to expose the truth without losing my daughter, without forcing your mother into exile. But I've learned that survival isn't a weakness. It's its own form of courage." Lisa reached for her mother's hand, a gesture that had become natural in the months since their reunion. "You did survive, and because you survived, we were able to finish what you started. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back immediately. Sometimes it's staying alive long enough to fight back when you can win." Catherine added her own perspective, born from years of living in the shadows while protecting others. "Justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right combination of courage and evidence to make the truth impossible to ignore." As they worked together in the late afternoon light, Margaret realized that the healing process was just beginning. The legal victory had been crucial, but the personal reconstruction, learning to be a family again after decades of separation, would take time, patience, and the kind of forgiveness that comes not from forgetting the past, but from choosing to build a better future. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted their work. Tom Sullivan appeared at the bottom of the attic stairs, still wearing his sheriff's uniform, but carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that suggested this was a personal rather than professional visit. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he called up, "but I wanted to share some news. The State Attorney General's office just announced they're opening investigations into suspicious workplace deaths in 12 other mill towns. They're using our case as a template for what to look for." The news was gratifying but not surprising. The Pemberton investigation had revealed patterns of corruption that extended far beyond a single family or a single town. Federal agencies were now actively seeking out similar cases, armed with the knowledge that systematic industrial murder was not just a historical problem, but an ongoing threat that required vigilant oversight. "There's something else," Tom continued, climbing the stairs to join them in the attic. "The Memorial Foundation has approved funding for a national database of suspicious workplace deaths. They want to name it the Sarah Mitchell Database for Worker Protection." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something that looked like completion. Her name, which had been erased from official records for over 2 decades, would now be permanently associated with protecting the kinds of workers she had tried to save in 1978. As evening approached and shadows began to gather in the attic, the group made their way downstairs to the kitchen where Catherine had prepared a simple dinner. The conversation around the table was a mixture of memories, plans for the future, and the kind of ordinary family discussion that none of them had dared hope they would share again. But it was Margaret who voiced what they were all thinking as they cleared the dishes and prepared to part ways for the evening. "We did it," she said simply. "We actually did it. We found the truth, we got justice, and we came home." Sarah smiled, looking around the kitchen where she had once been welcomed as a babysitter and was now welcomed as family. Sometimes the best victories are the ones that take decades to achieve, because by the time you win, you understand not just what you were fighting against, but what you were fighting for. The healing wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was real, substantial, and growing stronger with each shared meal. Each conversation, each moment of ordinary life that had been made possible by extraordinary courage. The babysitter who vanished in 1978 had finally come home, and in doing so, she had brought home the truth that justice, like love, is worth waiting for and worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. 5 years have passed since Margaret Henderson found that yellowed newspaper clipping in her grandmother's attic, and the small coastal town of Millbrook has become a symbol of something that once seemed impossible. The idea that truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually find its way to the surface. The memorial dedication ceremony takes place on a crisp October morning, exactly 27 years after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. The same harbor where she once walked as a young woman now hosts hundreds of people who have come to witness the unveiling of a monument that bears the names of over 300 workers, whose deaths have been reclassified as homicides following investigations inspired by the Pemberton case. Margaret stands at the podium facing the crowd, no longer the confused researcher who had stumbled upon a mystery, but a woman who has found her life's purpose in speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves. Her work with the National Worker Protection Foundation has helped expose industrial crimes in 17 states, leading to dozens of convictions and millions of dollars in compensation for victims' families. 27 years ago, Margaret begins, her voice carrying clearly across the harbor. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell tried to expose a conspiracy that had been murdering workers for decades. She was silenced, forced into hiding, separated from her daughter, and written out of official history. But she was not defeated. In the front row, Sarah Mitchell, now 67 years old and bearing the title of Chief Investigator for the Foundation, watches with pride as the young woman she once babysat delivers a truth that has taken nearly 3 decades to tell. Beside her sits Lisa Pemberton Chen, who kept her grandfather's surname as a reminder that even the most corrupted families can produce members willing to seek redemption through justice. The people who thought they could commit murder with impunity made one crucial mistake, Margaret continues. They underestimated the power of love, the love of a babysitter for the child she protected, the love of a mother for the daughter she couldn't raise, the love of workers for their families, and the love of ordinary people for simple justice. Tom Sullivan, now in his second term as sheriff and widely respected for his role in cleaning up local law enforcement, has brought his own family to the ceremony. His 10-year-old daughter sits beside him, listening to a story that has shaped her father's career and will likely influence her own understanding of right and wrong for the rest of her life. Elena Vasquez, now 93 and one of the last surviving mill workers from the 1970s, is helped to the podium by her great-grandson. Her voice may be frail, but her words carry the weight of decades of enforced silence finally broken. "For 40 years I kept quiet because I was afraid," Elena says, her accent still thick but her English clear. "I was afraid they would hurt my family. Afraid they would take away what little we had. Afraid that speaking truth would only bring more pain. but I learned something from these brave women. Sometimes staying silent is the most dangerous thing of all. Catherine Henderson watches from the crowd, her camera capturing every moment of a ceremony that represents not just justice for past crimes, but hope for future protection. Her book about the investigation, The Price of Silence, A Mother's 23-Year Journey, has become required reading in journalism schools across the country, teaching future reporters about the personal cost of pursuing truth in the face of institutional corruption. As the memorial is unveiled, a granite wall engraved with names, dates, and the inscription, "Their lives matter." Their deaths will not be forgotten. Their truth will protect others. Margaret sees in the crowd faces that represent the ripple effect of their investigation. Federal agents who have dedicated their careers to worker protection. Journalists who specialize in exposing industrial crimes. Lawyers who represent families against powerful corporations. Activists who fight for environmental justice. But it's the presence of families, children and grandchildren of workers who died in suspicious circumstances, that gives the ceremony its deepest meaning. These are people who spent decades believing their loved ones were simply unlucky, simply careless, simply expendable. Now they know the truth. Their family members were murdered, and their deaths have meaning, and their memory will help protect future workers from similar fates. The ceremony concludes with the reading of a letter from the current Secretary of Labor, announcing new federal regulations inspired by the Pemberton case. Workplace safety inspections will be conducted by independent agencies. Suspicious deaths will trigger automatic federal investigations. Pension funds will be protected by oversight mechanisms that make theft nearly impossible. As the crowd begins to disperse, Margaret finds herself standing with Sarah and Lisa at the harbor's edge, watching the waves crash against the same rocks where they had once huddled in a lighthouse, surrounded by evidence and afraid for their lives. "Do you think it was worth it?" Lisa asks, her question encompassing not just the 5 years since the investigation began, but the 27 years of separation, fear, and loss that preceded their victory. Sarah considers the question seriously, her eyes moving from the memorial to the faces of people who have been given closure, from the federal agents who now have tools to prevent future crimes, to the families who finally understand what really happened to their loved ones. Every worker who goes home safe because of new regulations, every family that gets justice instead of silence, every young person who chooses a career fighting corruption instead of accepting it. Yes, it was worth it, Sarah says. But more than that, we proved something that powerful people hoped we'd never figure out. "What's that?" Margaret asks. Sarah's smile carries the wisdom of someone who has lived through fear and emerged into truth. "We proved that justice isn't something that's given to us by authorities or institutions. Justice is something we create for ourselves, by refusing to accept that some people are above the law, by insisting that every life has value, and by never, ever giving up on the truth." As the three women walk away from the memorial, their footsteps echoing on the harbor stones where Sarah once feared for her life, they carry with them the knowledge that their story will inspire others to ask dangerous questions, to challenge powerful interests, and to demand accountability from those who believe they can commit crimes with impunity. The babysitter who vanished in 1978 has become something more than a victim who achieved justice. She has become a symbol of the possibility that ordinary people, armed with courage and guided by love, can defeat even the most entrenched corruption. And in a world where power often protects the guilty at the expense of the innocent, that may be the most important truth of all. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Because somewhere out there, another Sarah Mitchell is waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right questions and persistent enough to demand answers. The question is, will you be that person?